Hey, welcome back to Anatomy. The CDC said wear a mask, cloth face covering. Going to New York said it can be a stylish bandana. My mask has eye protection as well. Suck it N95 mask. I win. Hashtag flatten the curve. Hashtag we're all in this together. So today we're going to talk about the brain. You're asking yourself, is he going to wear this mask the whole time? And my answer is, what am I going to do? Take it off and get a computer virus? No. So, the brain. Let's go. So, the brain is divided into two cerebral hemispheres. Then we have the diencephalon, the brainstem, which includes the midbrain pons medulla and the cerebellum. Here's the cerebrum. This is the major brainy part of the brain. It's divided into a left and a right hemisphere. Here we see the diencephalon, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So, diencephalon, midbrain, pons, medulla. These make up the brain. Now, as the brain develops, it's going to grow faster than the rest of the skull around it, which gives it all these little twists and turns and wrinkles. By the time you're about 12 years old, most of you have a relatively adult mind, at least in size. Now, in function, different story. There's about 10 billion neurons there. The brain is protected by the skull, obviously, because you can't wear a helmet everywhere, by membranes called meninges, and it's floating in fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. In addition to that, we have the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier protects your brain from blood. Now, as we talk about this, one thing to consider is that your brain is, in essence, the worst girlfriend you've ever had. Why? Because it's super self-obsessed. The brain is about 2% of your body weight, and it uses about 20% of the oxygen and glucose that you bring in. The brain does not tolerate change at all. Any changing fluid or ion balance or anything like that, the brain's going to kill you. So, self-obsessed, self-important, does not tolerate change, will kill you. Worst girlfriend ever. All right. The meninges are these membranes that cover the entire central nervous system, including the brain, and they protect you from, well, really from your brain slamming in the front of your skull. Now, there's fluid in between. Let's look at these layers. The outer layer is the dura mater. It's a thicker membrane. The middle part is called the arachnoid. And then the innermost layer is the pia mater. It's kind of the surface of the brain. You really can't separate those things out. The dura mater, like I said, it's the strongest of these. And they separate out and partition out the brain, like so. So now your brain can't slosh around inside your head when you come to a screeching halt. We'll look at these later. You see the falx cerebri, the falx cerebelli, the tentorium cerebelli. All of these limit movement of the brain inside the skull. The arachnoid, sometimes called the arachnoid mater, is a spider webby stuff. It's involved in reabsorbing the fluid here. In the subarachnoid space, here, we find cerebral spinal fluid, CSF, the pia mater right on the surface of the brain. CSF is made out of plasma, and it allows your brain, which is 4 pounds of tissue, maybe, floating around in your skull, to be virtually weightless. So when you slash your head to the side, your brain doesn't fall over. It's floating around in your head. It also helps protect the brain from trauma, and because blood and your brain are separate, hence the blood-brain barrier, it's going to carry nutrients and chemical signals to the brain. Here we see CSF circulating out. CSF is made here at a structure called the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is a specialized band of capillaries that filters out plasma and makes CSF, which then circulates down and around the spinal cord, back up here in the subarachnoid space, and it is reabsorbed there. CSF is kept at a constant volume. It's always being reabsorbed, and it's always being produced. It hangs from the roof of the ventricle, and like I said, they're specialized capillaries beds. We talked about glial cells when we talked about neurons. Here are some of those glial cells, ependymal cells. They use ion pumps to control the ionic composition of cerebral spinal fluid. Now, like I said, blood is separate from your brain. We have the blood-brain barrier. Again, your brain, 2% of your body weight, 20% of resources. Worst girlfriend ever. No other tissue depends on homeostasis like the brain does. It demands homeostasis. Without homeostasis, neurons would fire uncontrollably. In other tissues, stuff is changing all the time, not the brain. So we have the blood-brain barrier. Now, in order for you to get from the bloodstream out to the brain space, the surface of the brain, cerebral spinal fluid, whatever, then you've got to go through this barrier. You've got to go through the walls of the capillaries. Now, the walls of the capillaries here have tight junctions, complete tight junctions. You're not going to squeeze through the cell or between the cells here. If you want to go from the blood to the brain, you've got to go through that cell. And you've got to go through the basal lamina outside the cell. This is triggered by the astrocytes. The astrocytes, another glial cell. Oops. There's our second glial cell here. The astrocytes, not part of the blood-brain barrier, but they make it happen. They make those cells get as close as they possibly can together, so we get this barrier, the blood-brain barrier. Now, not everything is prevented from entering the brain by the blood-brain barrier. There are things that have to get into the brain, obviously. On your exam, you'll see a question that says, which of these can cross the blood-brain barrier? And you'll look at it, and you'll think about it, and you'll think about it. Here's the answer. It's freaking oxygen. Why can oxygen cross the blood-brain barrier? So you can live. Obviously, oxygen has to cross into your brain. Other things that have to cross, carbon dioxide, glucose, and anything that's fat soluble can cross the cell membrane anyway. The rest of the stuff kind of gets rejected. It's also not uniform. Different parts of the brain, the barrier will be different. Your brain wants nothing to do with your blood, but it still wants to make sure that it knows what your blood is doing. Micromanage that crap, even though it wants nothing to do with it. There's a vomiting center in the brainstem. Poison shows up in your blood or your digestive tract. That vomiting center fires and makes you vomit. Hypothalamus. There's multiple places where your brain is monitoring the condition of your blood, even though it's not in contact with your blood. If we take a cross section of the cerebral here, we see there's both gray and white matter. Gray matter's on the outside, and it is, of course, brown. White matter's on the inside, and it's whitish. So there's gray matter on the outside. These are made up of neuron cell bodies. White matter on the inside. Now, this gray matter on the outside we call the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the cerebrum. The white matter on the inside. This is made up of axons, myelinated axons, because myelin is white. Here's the cerebrum, the largest part of your central nervous system, associated with your conscious thought and behavior. Higher mental function. This is intelligence and memory and learning and emotion and all that crap. This cerebral cortex is where those cell bodies are found. Outer part of this. We divide the cerebral cortex into a left and a right hemisphere. Structure anatomically that divides that is called the longitudinal fissure, separating you into a left and a right hemisphere. Each hemisphere then is divided into 5 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and this area right there called the insula. The wrinkles and things you see here on the brain, gyri and sulci. A sulcus is the groove, and the gyrus is the raised part here. So before you ask, no, you don't get a new wrinkle in your brain every time you learn something. That's stupid. If anybody ever tells you that, you can tell them that's stupid, and then they learn something, and they still didn't get a freaking wrinkle in their brain. You're welcome. Moving on. Raised place, gyrus, grooves, sulcus. Some of them are anatomical landmarks, so they get their own name. The lateral sulcus, for instance, is here. It divides the temporal lobe from the rest of the brain. The central sulcus is here. It divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So there's the lateral sulcus. Here's the central sulcus. Now, there are different types of areas here in the cerebral cortex, not to be confused with different types of neurons. There are 3 different types of neurons: motor neurons, sensory neurons, and what are called interneurons. All the neurons in the brain are interneurons. More on that later. But these are functional areas of the brain. Motor areas coordinate voluntary movement. Sensory areas are your awareness of sensation, and association areas make sense of all of it. Like I said, conscious behavior involves the entire cerebral cortex, or like secret part of the brain or something. All right. Now, let's look at the areas of the cerebral cortex. We have the precentral gyrus here. The precentral gyrus is the primary, screw that up, the primary motor cortex. This is where conscious movement begins. So when you move, it starts here. We've mapped this out. This is called a homunculus. The motor homunculus is a map of different regions here. And they correspond with the neurons that control that part of the body. So here's the neurons that control your face and the neurons that control your hand. Notice that the hand and the face are much bigger than the rest of the body because there are more motor neurons going to your hand than your face than there are the rest of the body. Just a second. I'm trying to get this thing worked out. All right. The postcentral gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex. This is where general sensation ends up. Touch, pain, temperature, that sort of thing. Here's the sensory homunculus. Again, notice the hands and the face are much larger because there's more sensory neurons going to the hands and the face than there are any other place in your body. Then we have the primary special sensory region. There's the primary visual cortex back there in the occipital lobe. There's the primary auditory cortex here in the temporal lobe, and the primary gustatory cortex here, and the olfactory cortex here. Now, these are all basic things, basic sensation. But the brain is a lot more, there's a lot more brain here than just those dark colored regions through here. That's because the brain is a lot more than that. There's a lot more than just flexion and extension and light and dark and single tones and others. That's the rest of the brain. The rest of the brain is called the association cortex. The association cortex is most of the cerebral cortex. It's higher order information. Here's the sensory association cortex. It makes sense of all the sensory info coming in. There's the motor association cortex that allows you to plan and coordinate more complicated movements. There's a visual association cortex and an auditory association cortex. There's this whole prefrontal cortex up here. There's a lot more brain. Now, the visual association area allows you to associate what you see now with things that you've seen before. So that even though you've never seen that chair before, you know that the object's a chair and you sit there. You know how to sit there. It's a chair. The auditory association area allows you to perceive tones and patterns in tones so that music makes sense and speech makes sense. Agnosia is the lack of ability to recognize something, shapes, smells, sounds, people, while everything else is fine. Like your eyes work, but you don't recognize objects for what they are. A great case of this is in a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And in the title study, this music professor thinks he has a vision issue. And finally, a neurologist is called in. And at some point during this interview with the neurologist, the guy walks to the door and attempts to pick up his wife and put her on his head. And when she talks, he's like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. I thought you were my hat." And it becomes obvious that he doesn't actually recognize objects for what they are. He sees them, but then he just guesses at what they are based on position. The only way he can get dressed in the morning is that his wife puts his clothes in the right place. He could put any clothes there, and he would put the same thing on. Or a dress for all he knows, because he doesn't recognize objects. He just guesses at them based on position. He doesn't know what people are. If you're standing still and you don't make any noise, you might as well be a houseplant. Another form of this is called apraxia, which is the loss of ability to map out physical actions like walking or doing multiple things at the same time. Here is unilateral neglect syndrome, another type of agnosia where the patient denies half the visual field and usually half the body. You give them a plate of food to eat, and they'll eat half of it and then deny the other half exists. They complain about not getting enough food. Turn the plate around. They're like, why the hell didn't you just put that there to begin with? They'll put makeup on their face. Here's spontaneous drawing where they draw the clock on one side of the clock, face on one half of the face. And they deny half the body. They'll dress half their body. Show them a mirror, it just makes them crazy. It just pisses them off. And these sort of weird things are caused by different lesions to these different association areas. Some association areas include the speech centers, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area back here is the sensory region for understanding the words that are spoken to you. Broca's area is the motor region for actually talking, so that you form the motions necessary to speak. Now, Broca's area and Wernicke's area are typically on the left side of the brain. On the opposite side of the brain, the right side, contralateral to Broca's area and Wernicke's area, we have areas we call the effective language areas. Effective language areas control the prosody of language. Prosody is the emotional content of speech. It's the non-spoken part of speech, rhythm and pitch and intonation. You know that your wife is mad even though she says, it's fine. You know it's not fine. You can tell by the tone of their voice. That's prosody. Now, there's an area that's opposite both Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Contralateral to Broca's area, you find the region that's involved in putting emotion in your own speech so that other people know you're pissed off. Contralateral to Wernicke's area is your ability to understand that there's emotion in speech, understanding that emotion. Lesions to these regions cause issues. Broca's aphasia, as patients are unable to speak because they can't make the motions necessary to talk. Injury to Wernicke's area causes Wernicke's aphasia. They can speak, but it doesn't mean anything. The language, the words, they have the right rhythm, but they're not making sentences with those words. And the effective language area is a lesion here we would call a prosody. Patients would be unable to either recognize emotion in someone else's speech or unable to convey that in their own speech. I had a professor like this, and he had one volume, and it was really freaking loud and one tone. So flat monotone and really loud, whether you were in his office or in the classroom, really loud, flat tone. And it was physics. It was the worst class ever. His explanation of quantum physics involved a van and the speed of light, and it was horrible. Anyway, moving on. The prefrontal cortex is another example of an association area. It's an important part for your ability to tell cause and effect. That you know that your actions have consequences. This gets interesting. How do we know this? Well, we know this because of an accident. And this accident involved a guy named Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas Gage worked on the railroad. And this is like the 1800s or whatever. And his job was to take this metal spike and basically pack blasting powder down into this big ass pipe bomb that they were putting in the ground to blow up mountains so they could build the railroad across the country or whatever. He's in this one day, and this thing he's got is flat on one end and it's sharp on the other end. So uh, the flat end, he'd pack this blasting powder down in there, and then the sharp end, he'd like stick the fuse down in, and then they go back and pull the Wile E. Coyote thing, press the plunger or whatever. So one day he's doing this, and he's packing this down there, and something went wrong, and it sparked, and it shot that spike up under his chin and out the top of his head and like 50 feet down the road, blew part of his brain. They run over there. There's blood and brain everywhere. They're like, he's obviously dead. He's not dead yet. It becomes Monty Python from here on out. He's not dead yet. And he's not. And he survives this. But it wasn't the same. Phineas Gage before was a pretty good guy. Fairly young guy. Worked on the railroad. Had a pretty important job. He's gotten promoted. Everybody likes him. Afterwards, he's an ass. No, most accounts have him. His personality changes. Now it's not like he just all of a sudden becomes this incredible villain, but it changes his personality. He loses friends. He loses his job. This is another job. He ends up selling his skull to the British Museum before he even dies, just so he can have some money. But he loses the ability to have this sort of cause and effect idea, to understand that his actions have consequences, to have willpower. Say, maybe I shouldn't go spend all my money on prostitutes. Now, what happened has gotten lost over the years, and by many accounts, the effects of this were greatly exaggerated. But let's fast forward a few years to the 1950s. In the 1950s, a physician by the name of Dr. Walter Freeman hypothesized that he can manipulate psychological disorders. He's a psychiatrist by manipulating this prefrontal cortex. So Dr. Freeman enlists the help of a neurosurgeon, and they do the first prefrontal lobotomy. They make an incision, they remove part of the skull, and they take part of this prefrontal cortex out. And by Dr. Freeman's account, it's great. The unfortunate thing for Dr. Freeman is he's not a surgeon, and this takes forever. So he's got this shortcut. So what he does is he invents something called the transorbital prefrontal lobotomy. Now, transorbital means it goes through the orbit, the eye socket. So what Dr. Freeman did, he picked up an ice pick off his kitchen counter, and he got a hammer. And the first patient he did this on, he anesthetized them with electricity, uh, headphones on their head right here on the temporal bones, and administered a crap load of electricity, shocked the hell out of them, and induced a seizure. Then he took this ice pick, lifted up their eyelid, put it up under their eyelid, and jammed it in their head and scrambled it around and destroyed part of that prefrontal cortex. If you want to see a documentary, albeit dramatized, about Dr. Freeman, then I suggest that you get on your Amazon Prime account and watch a show called Lore, Lore, Lore. There is one about Dr. Freeman. And there are some real pictures there, and some real film. It is disturbing and sad. Here's Dr. Freeman doing a couple of transorbital prefrontal lobotomies. Now, Dr. Freeman's a bit of a showman. He's also a bit of an asshole, but he's a showman. Here you see him lobotomizing, a patient. He's doing both eyes at the same time. Here, he's lobotomizing this child. Those were popular patients. Because Dr. Freeman was under the impression that he could fix any sort of personality disorder with this. You have a teenager that's a smartass. You know what fixes that? Lobotomy. You have a wife that has PMS every month. You know what'll fix that? Lobotomy. Maybe you're depressed. You know what'll make you feel a little better? Lobotomy. Actually, the answer to none of that is lobotomy, but he did this for a while. He was convinced of its positive benefits. He lobotomized a lot of people. But one person that he did lobotomize was Rosemary Kennedy, which was John F. Kennedy's older sister. Now, he was a bit overzealous. And before, Rosemary was a bit slow. When her father, who was the ambassador to the United Kingdom, took her to see the Queen, she practiced the curtsy she was supposed to do for hours. And when the Queen came to meet her and she curtsied, she fell down. She was slower than the rest of them, and they were worried that she would embarrass them. So Mr. Kennedy had her lobotomized and did not tell anyone else. Dr. Freeman, when, like I said, was a bit overzealous, and when he finished, she was what we would call now developmentally disabled, and she was unable to take care of herself. Lived out the rest of her years in a nursing home. When President Kennedy was elected, no one knew where she was, and the press was just told she was very reclusive and did not want the press, and so she had secluded herself from the rest of the family. When in reality, she was in a care facility for people with mental problems, or not like an asylum, more like a rest. And it wasn't until after um, John Kennedy's father died, Joe Kennedy died, that they figured out where she was and that she had been placed in this home. Um, she died several years ago, but and you can find pictures online. You can find the story. I believe there's a dramatized movie about this as well. It's a really sad thing. But like I said, Dr. did this for years until they made him stop. And they're like, you can't do this anymore. You're driving a freaking ice pick into people's heads. Obviously, there's a better way. Drugs. We invented drugs, and after that, we're great. All right. So that's the cerebral cortex, the gray matter on the outside. The white matter in the middle is a different story. The white matter, this is axons that connect different parts of the brain. We have this internal capsule, axons that connect the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord. We have the association fibers, which connect different parts of the same hemisphere, like Wernicke's area and Broca's area. And we have the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres. Now, this is where we're going to stop, and we're going to pause here, and we're going to come back and talk about the corpus callosum and the rest of the brain in another video. I was going to say in a while, but I suppose for you, it's the same time, because you could just binge watch my entire video library. Netflix special coming up. So I will see you, not see you shortly.